tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So continuing on with Venerable Father, A Life with Ajahn Chah. This is chapter 5. And so I think at this point it's after Varapanyo's fourth vasa and going to his fifth. 2 days before Vasa, I went over to Wat Bung Wai, and Wat Bung Wai is Wat Pananachat. It's Bung Wai village, so they used to call it Wat Bung Wai, but it's Wat Pananachat, as we know now. Wat Bung Wai is in itself a major chapter in Ajahn Chah's biography, and there are others who can tell its story in better detail. By this time, the monks had been there about 4 months. The idea of having a Farang Wat had been in circulation for a while, but when it happened, it came about without planning, which is the way it usually happened with the growth of the branch monasteries. The merit and purity of the practice seemed to create appropriate situations. Like Longpor, Ajahn Sumedho could be tough or gentle. When I had returned from Bung Khao Luang, he was visiting Wat Papong. I was talking with another monk about my uncertainty as to where to spend Vasa, and we got into rehashing our doubts. Suddenly Ajahn Sumedho interrupted. In a most forceful tone, okay, I'm not going to use the F word here, but in a most forceful tone, he said, "None of you are willing to give up an effing thing. Not one of you. Life is dull in these monasteries. It's boring. Longpor says you have to die." But usually his talk was clear and simple, almost comforting. He was pointing at the essence of the practice, which is seeing the 3 characteristics. He said he felt that there was generally too much emphasis on the tough talk and the ascetic side of the practice without getting at the heart of the matter. Longpor himself, he said, had begun to say that the Toraman methods of the old days of Wat Papong had not really produced satisfactory results, especially for the Westerners, who tended to be guilt-ridden and compulsive about meditation. This didn't seem to be the best approach. Informal talks that he gave when he visited Wat Papong before Vasa had been very refreshing to me. Something clicked inside me, and I realized that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, i.e., observing the 3 characteristics, and that I need not be anxious about the undefinable something else that I usually felt I was failing to do. On the first night of Vasa, Ajahn Sumedho told us what the schedule would be. The emphasis would clearly be on formal meditation practice, not on the endless Vinaya readings, talks, and work projects that went on in most of the branch monasteries, and encouraged us to just do the practice as it was set up, without second thoughts, and that if we did so, mindfulness would become habitual, and we'd find that we'd be able to live our lives out mindfully. That sounded reasonable to me, and quite wonderful. What more could a person ask for, really? But it still seemed like a distant goal. There was also more of a harmony of purpose than I'd felt before. No temporary ordinations, kids who were in the monastery only because their parents had sent them, and easy communication with each other without cultural barriers that often could lead to misunderstanding and bad feeling. This was not to say that everything was perfect, of course. We had much to learn about living with each other, and Ajahn Sumedho had many trials and lessons about being a teacher waiting for him. Still, the overall feeling was very good, and there were many factors that hadn't been present in past situations in other places. The Vasa went on, the schedule intensified. It wasn't easy, but it was good. Meanwhile, our fame was spreading. When lay people went to see Longpa, he would ask them if they'd seen Sumedho's Wat yet, Added to the already solid support of Bungwai villagers, all these townspeople coming with food, and often seeking lottery numbers, made for a pretty substantial diet, and most of us started getting fat, especially me. Longpor would make his usual jokes, calling it Wat Ba Woon Wai, meaning forced monastery of confusion, or calling it Wat Ba America Wat. But he obviously thought it was a good thing, and the lay people who came did too. Yet I doubt anyone could have envisioned how the place would develop in the near future. That first vasa, there was only 9 or 10 kutis and 2 gatop, grass huts with no floor, just a bed on the ground. Ajahn Sumedho lived in a small bamboo kuti with a grass roof, and we had a tiny grass-roofed sala with a dirt floor. Longpor came for a visit one afternoon during the vasa. Lay people came at night, and there were the usual Dhamma talks. After they had gone home, we were sitting with Longpa, and he directed us to set up a bed in the open for him. "I'll sleep here," he said, "and Warapanyo will massage my feet all night." It was absurd, of course, but I had to do it. He lay down and I went to work. He seemed to doze off, but would then start talking to me. After a few hours, one of the monks offered to replace me for a bit so I could go do yoga. Longpor was sound asleep at that point, but the monk told me that as soon as I had gone, he woke up and said, "Where's Warapanyo? He didn't go to sleep, did he?" I returned to finish my vigil. Longpa was going to eat in a house, but he gave us a talk at dawn. He had a manner of knowing that the world waits for him, and it didn't matter that faithful villagers were waiting to put food in the bowls of hungry monks. One monk, who was a relative newcomer, had realized that he had committed a Sangha Disesa offense a long time ago, so he told Ajahn Sumedho, who told Longpa. Longpa took it a lot better than he usually did. It was one of the few things that seemed to put him in a wrathful way. He reminded us of the scriptural analogy of putting it in the mouth of a cobra and told us to contemplate that in times of lust. In the months to come, there would be a few other monks who found themselves with a similar problem, and there were a few pithy and hilarious comments from Longpa, but perhaps it is neither necessary nor appropriate to go into the details here. Suffice it to say that in time, the Sangha at Bungwai learned to do the parivasa process as we learned to do other Sangha functions. This was the first time I had spent a vasa without thinking about where I would go afterwards. Wat Bungwai was just the place where I was living, rather than a place of exile. Though I didn't quite feel I had attained to being able to live out my life mindfully, perhaps there really was something to what Ajahn Sumedho had said at the vasa's beginning. On the night after the vasa ended, Ajahn Sumedho asked us each to say something about how we felt about the previous month's experience. A young monk who was soon to lose his marbles and disrobe was the one to say he was now able to live his life out thus. His dignified bearing and seemingly impeccable mindfulness had been noticed by all, even Longpa. I used to say to myself, "Why can't you be more like him?" It was a classic example of the pitfalls of watching others, attaching to concepts, etc. That year, Longpa didn't make the rounds of the katina ceremonies of the branch monasteries as he usually did. It was another sign of his aging. In 1971 and 72, he was a young man. He would sweep leaves with us for hours and often go on the longest pindabat, and he was constantly traveling to the branch monasteries, which were just starting to proliferate then. By 1975, he seemed to have aged about 10 years. A year later, when work on the boat was in full swing, he would come out to oversee, but couldn't do much physically. One monk remarked how painful it was to watch him as he bent down to pick up a scrap of wood. He was clearly losing the battle against old age. He did come to our papa ceremony, however. It was a pretty humble affair, sponsored by the local railroad workers. They gave us each a blanket and a lantern. I remember how I prized those new acquisitions then. But life was never again to be so austere there. Ajahn Sumedho had observed, with regret, that we would probably never have the experience of lacking for anything. I didn't regret the prospect so much, but I was never as keen on asceticism as Ajahn Sumedho was. Ajahn Sumedho gave the first desana of the Papa. He talked about how some monks liked chanting and some didn't. Some preferred to do a lot of sitting meditation while others liked to walk more. Some agonized over whether or not it was permissible to eat cheese after noon. On and on and on. Most of us became bored and restless as he talked. There didn't seem to be much point to it. After he was finished, Luang Por spoke from his seat in a heavy, serious tone to the laypeople. I don't think you understand what Tan Sumedho was talking about. Probably not even one of you. And he went on to talk about non-discrimination, the question of the person who isn't going forward, isn't moving backward, isn't standing still. Where is he? The next day, Ajahn Sumedho said that his desana had been meant for Luang Por. He wanted to show him that somebody understood what he taught. He thought that would be the best gift he could give him. As Ajahn Sumedho came into his own as a teacher, one clearly had the impression of him as the man in charge, so it was always very moving to get these reminders of his devotion to his own master. Chapter 6. After the Katina season was over, Luang Por sent Ajahn Sumedho and another monk to Ayutthaya to study about Parivasa. This left me minding the shop for 2 weeks. I was only a 4-vasa monk, and certainly not a teacher, but all went smoothly. Such occasions always increased my reverence for the brilliance of the Vinaya and the way it was used in Ajahn Chah's Wat. Just applying ourselves to the daily routine and the monastic discipline was enough to keep everything functioning harmoniously. This particular occasion showed me how much I and others had grown. Even giving the required desanas to the laypeople in Lao became easy. One afternoon, Luang Por came to visit with a wealthy patroness. She seemed uncertain as to who this senior Farang monk was, so Luang Por introduced me. Ajahn wore a paño, he intoned. He's seen the Dhamma, realized the Dhamma. I felt like crawling under the seat. He spoke in such a serious way, but of course we all knew how much praise was worth. Over the years, I found that he would praise me a few times and I would start to look forward to seeing him. Then the next time he would throw shit all over me, often in front of a group of people, which could be quite humiliating and infuriating. The flow of new Farang monks, visiting laymen, and families of monks was increasing at that time. There was a similar feeling whenever a monk's parents visited. They obviously appreciated what was going on there, yet one could see that they'd much rather have their sons escape from this fate worse than death. Another similarity was something Ajahn Sumedho had long talked about, that most of us came from stable families with some basic moral values. In other words, we were sons of good families, as the scriptures would say. After disrobing and getting a look at all the broken marriages and children who were shuttled back and forth from one parent to the other, and American youth who seemed to be evolving into a generation of ghouls, this took on added meaning for me. Before the Vasa, I had received a letter from my grandmother expressing her wish that I would be in New York for my grandparents' 60th anniversary the following year. My first thought was, good luck, Granny. I hadn't left Ubon in 2.5 years and could hardly conceive of going to Bangkok, much less the U.S. But then I considered it. Maybe I could have them invite Luang Por as well, since before completing 5 Vasa, I really shouldn't travel by myself anyhow, and it might be the beginning of spreading his teaching to the West. When I mentioned it to him, it still seemed unreal to me, and all he said was that I couldn't go home when I was so skinny. It would give people a bad idea about Buddhism. But sometime after the Vasa, I mentioned it to Ajahn Sumedho, and one day he asked me if he could go in Luang Por's place, if the trip were really possible and Luang Por didn't want to go. Ajahn Sumedho hadn't seen his elderly parents for 12 years, and he had a standing invitation from a sponsor to pay his fare. Perhaps he also sensed that the time might be right for going to the West. We discussed it at Christmas time with Luang Por, who who said he wasn't sure if he could go. Then at Magha Puja, we asked him for a decision, since we had to start making plans. He said he was too busy with the boat, maybe next year, so Ajahn Sumedho would go with me. In the meantime, I suddenly became very sick with fever, aching, and nausea. I didn't eat for a few days, and when I didn't appear for evening coffee, the others knew I must really be ill. But such was the state of things that I didn't even consider going to a doctor or the Ubon hospital, not trying to be heroic, but because local medical care was, at its best, only slightly better than nothing, and the trip to town itself was quite an ordeal. The road that ran by the monastery was just in the process of being paved then. During the Vasa, a few monks had gotten sick, gone to the hospital, were tested for everything the docs could think of, and after several days, when the symptoms had subsided, somebody would decide that it was probably typhoid fever, which was what the villagers thought I had now, so they brought me gallon jugs of herbal medicine which tasted like detergent. It didn't do any harm, and the fever went down after a few days, but the nausea remained. Then we got word that some Air Force people would be coming to Tambun to make merit or offer food. They arrived one morning before the meal and walked around the Wat. When they gathered in the sala, they seemed to be quite blown away, having seen the simplicity in which we lived. To middle-class Bangkok people like them, Northeast Thailand was like Siberia, so how could we from the Western paradises live like this? They immediately took up a collection to start building a proper sala and another collection to help with the expenses of our planned trip to the U.S. That evening, Ajahn Sumedho and I took the train to Bangkok with some of them and a local supporter, Pansak, himself a retired Air Force officer, so that we could check out possible discounts for plane tickets. I had asked the doctor from the local health station for something to prevent motion sickness. He asked me what my symptoms were and listened thoughtfully as I described them. He returned that evening to take us to the station, gave me some Dramamine, and said, "Ajahn Warapanyo, what you have is called gas in the stomach." We were invited to stay at a place near the airport which some Air Force people had built for monks to use. Mercifully, our new patrons, Colonel Sak and Ma Bao, had our seats changed to a sleeper. In the morning, we went to their house for the meal. Though the food was excellent, I could hardly touch it. Ma Bao noticed that I didn't look too well and asked if I'd like to see a doctor. Then we set off with Pansak. First, we went to the home of General Chu, the head of Thai International. His wife was there and gave us some information. In those days, they didn't fly to the U.S. We went to Air Siam, a new airline. The director, Captain Tawi, was an ardent practitioner and a follower of some of the northeastern Ajahns, but he'd never seen Farang monks before. He seemed quite moved and said that he'd give us free tickets to California. We found out later that they were his own tickets. Each year, and he and his wife could take a trip anywhere the airline flew to, and right there on the spot, he decided to give them away. When word got back to Thai Inter, they also gave us free tickets from London to Bangkok. Then we thought that we could afford to take Pansak along as a steward, the faithful, generous, luckless patron who'd been so helpful for so many years. Air Siam gave him a ticket at a 1/3 price, which was promptly matched by Thai International. I got to see a doctor that first night, a real doctor. In about 90 seconds, he diagnosed me as having hepatitis. He gave me some medicines and told me to get lots of rest. When Ajahn Sumedho returned to Ubon, Ma Bao invited me to stay at the small sala by her house while I recuperated. This was a much different situation from anything I'd experienced as a monk. I was on my own, in close proximity to lay people, surrounded by all the luxuries a bhikkhu could imagine. The residential area that I walked through every morning for Pindapat resembled suburban America more than it did rural Thailand, or even the neighborhoods around the Wats in Bangkok, but it all went quite smoothly. I felt like I knew how to use the Vinaya to keep a proper distance from it all and to maintain my practice, but without becoming uptight. I'm sure I couldn't have done that a couple of years before then. It was another positive sign and gave me confidence for the trip to the U.S. It was also refreshing for me to have a change of scene from the poverty-stricken Northeast. When I'd been at Wat Ba Klaw, where the soil was more fertile and the villagers a little better off than at places like Nong Hai, I began to think that when living conditions were too harsh, it sometimes kept the mind in a rough state. Of course, it's a matter of individual temperament and what a person may need at a particular point in time. Sometimes Luang Por himself would talk about the four sapaya, the necessity of having suitable food, dwelling, climate, and people, whereas at other times he would urge practitioners to seek out adverse conditions. At any rate, I rather enjoyed my convalescence in these celestial surroundings and kept busy by translating Entrance to the Vinaya, Volume 3, for the Somdet of Wat Bawan. Finally, the time came to return to Ubon. It was mid-April, and we would be leaving for California in early May. I wasn't sick, but still weak, and the doctor had warned me to be careful about overexertion lest I damage my liver, which can take 2 months to 2 years to get back to normal after hepatitis. I got a ride in a car with Pansak and a friend of his. We arrived in the evening, and I decided to go out to Wat Pah and pay my respects to Luang Por before going to Bung Wai. It was extremely hot. It had been a long day, and I was on wobbly legs. Work was going on at the boat site. We found Luang Por, who immediately started giving me the business. "So you've come back, you lazy guy. Look how fat you are. I'll put you to work pounding earth. That's what you need." Just to look at one of those pounders was painful. My defenses were low, and I didn't find this very amusing. Sometimes he liked to make you feel miserable before you even got a chance to sit down, it seemed. The next morning I went on the short pindabat, and as we waited for him at the first houses, he walked up, pointed at me, and said to a new bhikkhu, "This one's already dead. Look how fat he is. Dead." And the following morning, he started talking about how much trouble I was. "I could have 20 other monks and they'd be less trouble than one of you." I seriously began to wonder if I'd worked my way into his doghouse somehow, though I couldn't think of any real misdeeds I'd committed recently. I hadn't even been at Wat Pah for 9 months. It was quite heavy, and the feeling remained with me even during the trip to the U.S., and it wasn't until my father told me that Ajahn Sumedho had said that I was one of Luang Por's favorites, and that therefore he liked to tease me, that I felt reassured. Our trip had been intended for the purpose of visiting our families, but in Bangkok and then in the U.S., people asked Ajahn Sumedho to talk to them. He would often seem to be struggling as he began, but after a few minutes he would get comfortable, get a feeling for what was appropriate to the occasion, and you could feel the room light up with interest. I was especially impressed by the way he was able to talk to lay people in the U.S., because he'd been away for so long. Just before leaving California for New York, I tore the cartilage in my knee, so when Ajahn Sumedho returned to Thailand via England, I stayed in New York to have surgery. It turned out that Ajahn Sumedho had gone to stay at the Thai Wat in London, feeling that it would be the appropriate place to stay, even though the English Sangha Trust House had been recommended to us. But the Thai Wat was very crowded, so he left after a day and went to the EST place, where it seemed they'd been waiting and hoping for a proper bhikkhu to show up. He made a big impression on them, and when I stopped there in August, they were preparing to go to Thailand and invite Ajahn Chah to send some monks to live there. So without planning, another situation had developed for spreading the Dhamma. I stayed in my parents' house for another 2 months after Ajahn Sumedho left, and I again found that I could keep the Vinaya without getting uptight over it. In general, the yellow robes and elaborate code of rules didn't seem to be as strange to people as I would have thought. In California, I had seen and heard of several groups of people practicing in different Buddhist traditions. This was quite a change from when I'd left 7 years before, and in Thailand I'd heard a little of the news, but didn't have any accurate idea of the extent of it. In the suburbs of New York, however, such things were not to be found. and I looked forward to getting back to Thailand and to the forest. And we'll read this one more chapter, chapter 7. I'll read part of this anyway. My knee was slow to heal, so I waited and returned to enter the second vasa. This is the second vasa refers to if you're late for the vasa, you can enter vasa a month later, usually in full moon of August. A month after the rest of the Sangha had entered, still walking with a cane, Mike, a layman interested in ordaining, traveled with me from New York, and we took the train to Ubon together. Arriving at Wat Pah Pong, I was very moved to be back, and, full of reverence, went to see Luang Pa. But as he saw me approaching his kuti, he started shouting at me, "No good, I won't have it, don't want it, too fat, I won't have it." In silence, I kneeled clumsily on one knee, the closest I could come to prostrating. He quizzically asked, "Like that, huh?" and continued with his torrent of abuse. "What did you do? Live in your mother's kitchen?" "You've got to fast for a week, eat leaves for a month." An unsmiling, tight-lipped Ajahn Liam, who was second in charge now, showed me to my kuti. I was exhausted from the train and from Luang Pa's verbal flogging, so I decided to skip the meal. Though fasting had always been uncomfortable for me, I fasted 4 days and started fasting a day or two every week. The sudden change of climate and the drastic change in diet left me with little appetite, and I did have plenty of weight to spare. Every morning when I looked into my bowl before the meal began, it was a grim sight to behold. I would think of the words of a once popular song, "You don't know how lucky you are, boys, back in the USSR." After I disrobed and went to visit Mike, I heard him telling some friends of his about the food at Wat Pah Pong. "Normally you couldn't pay me to eat that stuff. Some of those fish concoctions. There's better looking stuff down at the bait shop." I had never spent a vasa at Wat Pah Pong, and this was the long-awaited number 5, but it was all rather anticlimactic. I felt reasonably comfortable as a bhikkhu by this time, so I didn't feel like I was struggling to cross a finish line anymore. Luang Pa wasn't teaching much, and I couldn't take part in the group practice because of my knee. Even at mealtime, I sat outside the eating hall where I could let my bad leg hang over the edge of the seat. Actually, there wasn't even much group practice because of the work on the boat, mostly just building up the hill on which it was to sit. Some of the monks would work during the day, then everyone would come out following afternoon chores and continue long past dark, sometimes until midnight. One night I walked out to have a look, and Mike, who was carrying dirt and dripping sweat, looked up at me and said, "My Asian holiday." With Luang Pa, of course, work was part of practice like anything else. In his approach to practice, you didn't just do what was normal or sensible, but pushed beyond ordinary limits to break habits of body and mind. So that's how we worked. I say we because as my knee healed, I started working, though perhaps it's easier to appreciate Luang Pa's methods from the safe distance my disability gave me through much of the vasa. There were a few Farangs spending vasa at Wat Pah Pong, and they weren't getting any instruction, so I offered to teach Vinaya, which Luang Pa approved. I had heard Vinaya teachings many times over and had read most of the Vinaya Pitaka, and had learned over the years how to use it properly, so I was confident I could teach it and also give some pointers on life in Luang Pa's Wat. I could see how the system itself prepares people for transmitting something to those who come later. And in the years since then, there have always been capable people to take charge at Wat Bung Wai and other places. Luang Pa often used to ask his monks, "If you can't practice properly and maintain harmony now, what will you do after I'm gone?" Well, now he's gone, even though his body lingers on, and I think most people are pleased with the way the Sangha is held together. There wasn't a lot of time for hanging out with him due to the work on the boat, but I went pindabat with him and one old monk in the nuns' village while my knee was still healing, and there were, of course, the occasional unforgettable vignettes. Once, I walked by his kuti after the chores. My kuti was in the forest behind his. He called out to me as he sat speaking with a monk. I knelt down on the ground and he asked, "When you were in America, did women try to touch you?" "No, that hadn't been a problem," I said. "Did people ask you why you couldn't touch women?" "Yes, they did." "How did you answer them?" I explained that it was to help preserve the brahmacharya, the celibate life. "Wrong answer," he said, and then after his theatrical pause, "You should have told them, if a monk touches a woman, he'll get a stomachache." Oh. So the mythical 5 vasas had gone by, and it now seemed like it hadn't really been such a long time. When I first met Ajahn Sumedho, when I was a newly ordained novice, he said, "Life is short, so I want to do something good with my life." I said to him, "You really think life is short? To me it seems interminably long." But a couple of years later, I started to notice the time going by quickly. It seemed like every time I turned around, another 2 weeks had passed, and it was time to shave my head again. At Wat Nong Hai, I started thinking, only 29 months and 3 weeks until I enter my 5th vasa. And now it had come to pass. In many ways, I felt like the same person, but big changes had occurred. It really seemed that my sojourning in the lower realms was behind me. Luang Por had often said that being beyond dependence didn't just mean hanging out for 5 years and then grabbing your bowl and taking off. Yet I often felt that I had done little more than hang out or hang in. And I thought that just being in the Wat and keeping the Vinaya would have a substantial effect on almost anyone. George Sharp of the English Sangha Trust arrived in December 1976. Luang Por was away, and though he had come to offer a vihara, monastic dwelling, and lay support, he received the usual, quote, hospitality, unquote, from Ajahn Liam, sleeping in the sala, eating out of a grungy basin while sitting on the concrete outside the eating hall. I didn't even think about it, but Ajahn Sumedho was quite upset when he heard, especially since he later took a trip with George to see Ajahn Mahabua, where the treatment was much better, and Ajahn Mahabua has a reputation for giving guests a hard time. When I mentioned it to Luang Por, however, all he said was, "We are not Mahabua." Everyone knows how it turned out. Ajahn Mahabua didn't feel that any of his monks were ready to go to England, though he did emphasize that if he did send monks, the separation of Dhammayut and Mahanikaya sects would have to be maintained. Luang Por agreed to go in May with Ajahn Sumedho. An English monk, Kemadamo, with whom I had ordained. I didn't realize that. He ordained with Luang Por Kemadamo. Wow. With whom I had ordained.
And Joseph.
And with Joseph, okay, group of 3.
3 of them ordained, of course, in Warren.
Oh, okay, right. Before Luang Por was at Upachaya. Oh, okay, remarkable. An English monk, Kemadamo, with whom I had ordained, was going to visit his parents, so he went along. 2 other junior monks went from the US and Canada and stopped in London afterwards, and Luang Por decided to leave them all there. George would come to my kuti in the evening to drink cocoa and talk. He was going through some emotional upheaval at the time, in addition to the rigors of the trip and the battle he'd been fighting to salvage the English Sangha Trust. After talking for a long time on one of his first evenings there, he said, "Well, I feel a bit better now. I was feeling rather disoriented and depressed for a while here." I said, "I know what you mean. I felt that way the first 2 or 3 years I was here." That was also the year of Luang Por's Christ Buddhamas Desana. The Sangha at Bung Wai had decided to celebrate Christmas and invited the lay people to join, and invited Luang Por also. As Jack Cornfield tells it, the lay people were a little skeptical or upset. Why, they asked, were Buddhist monks celebrating Christmas? Luang Por, therefore, gave a talk on the purpose of religion. As far as he understood it, he said, Christianity taught people to do good and avoid evil, just as Buddhism did. So what was the problem? However, if people were upset by the idea of celebrating Christmas, that was easily remedied. We would no longer call it Christmas. Let's call it Christ Buddhamas. As far as I know, having been there for a visit on December 25th, 1981, the occasion is still celebrated with food offerings and dasanas, and whether or not the story is perfectly true may not be so important. Luang Por himself used to embellish stories of other people's words and deeds and adjust them to fit his purposes for teaching. Ajahn Chah wasn't a student of comparative religion. He didn't know the teachings of other religions or other sects of Buddhism in detail, but he certainly had realization of what religion is all about, and he liked to emphasize that which was common to different religions and to separate name from fact. When someone asked him why there was so much crime in Thailand, a Buddhist country, or why Indochina was such a mess, he said those aren't Buddhists doing those things. That isn't Buddhism doing those things. Those are people doing those things. Buddha never taught anything like that. He once mentioned that when he was a child, there were some Christian children in his school. When the kids would be playing in the schoolyard, one would shout, "I'm Buddhist," another would shout, "I'm Christian," and a fight would break out. So this was what quarreling between religions amounted to, kids in the schoolyard fighting over names. When 1977 began, I decided that I would like to go to Bangkok to get acupuncture for my knees, and then go Tudong. Just at that time, an Australian monk showed up at Wat Pah Pong to take leave of Luang Por before going Tudong. The night before he left, I went to Luang Por's kuti, but sat behind the wall instead of joining the others sitting in front of Luang Por. He was talking to the monk about the benefits of Tudong. I don't remember many of the details, mainly that he praised it, and said that even if one wasn't ready to proclaim the Dhamma, he could proclaim the brahmacharya through one's behavior, thereby inspiring faith in others. And he told the story about Sariputta, who was led to the Dhamma by seeing a bhikkhu walking Pindabat and feeling inspired by his dignified deportment. The next night I went to him and told him of my plans. "Tudong? Why do you want to go Tudong?" he said, and proceeded to expound on the uselessness of wandering around. It was a good example of how he didn't have stock answers for people. Maybe he wanted to test me. Maybe he really thought I shouldn't go. I think that good teachers hope that their disciples will eventually learn how to think for themselves, or how to not think, perhaps, and make their own decisions with a clear mind. He surprised me time and time again, and over the years I finally came to realize that he wasn't predictable. There was once a fellow named Ron, an arrogant young American who came to Wat Pah Pong. He had gotten a grant to do a study of Buddhism, and as part of the project he was going to ordain for a while. He had come to interview Ajahn Chah. When I first took him to see Luang Por, I mentioned that he was planning to ordain, thinking this would be pleasing to Luang Por, who usually would suggest to any Farang visiting Wat Pah Pong that the only decent use of their time on earth would be to ordain. But to Ron, he said, "Why do you want to ordain? It's a lot of trouble. You probably wouldn't like it." I was surprised to hear that, but I think he sized the guy up right away. He said a few things that were unpalatable to Ron. When Ron expressed his disagreement, I remarked that Luang Por teaches the Dhamma that is never wrong. It may disagree with us, but then we are wrong, not Dhamma. How does he know, Ron? How does he know, Ron argued. Maybe that's just his opinion. Anyhow, I went. I was in Bangkok for several weeks. Acupuncture really did help my knees, but just as I was ready to leave for the south, I got sick. It was only a flu, but when it came on, it was similar to the beginnings of hepatitis. That kicked off a chain reaction of thoughts. I'd spent quite a lot of the last 2 years recuperating from one condition or another, and the thought of continuing to do so was not appealing. Though I knew I had benefited from enduring illness, I now felt that my practice was at a low ebb, largely due to being in poor physical condition and not having much energy to practice, So for the first time, I seriously began to think about disrobing. During the first difficult years in robes, I often wished I were somewhere else, but I never really thought about disrobing as an option that was open to me. It would have been like leaving the hospital in the middle of a surgery. When I was in the U.S., I felt some attraction to what sometimes appeared to be celestial conditions for living and practicing, but I could see through it to perceive many of the problems of lay life. Indeed, before going there, I had been experiencing a phase that Ajahn Chah had predicted and warned me about, i.e., attraction to family life, thinking that I'd learned enough to be a good layman and could raise a family in a proper way according to Dhamma, etc. But when I actually saw old friends who were married, I was impressed more by their suffering than anything else, and it really knocked that fantasy out of me. Now, however, I realized that if I were to leave, I wouldn't die of grief or guilt. I had completed the 5 vasa. I felt I could take care of myself, and I knew I'd continue to practice wherever I lived. And the trip to the West had shown me that there were teachers and sanghas to be found outside of the walls of the monastery. It seemed that my practice so far had consisted largely of hanging in there, and while that had certainly been appropriate up to now and had brought much benefit, perhaps it had reached the point of diminishing returns, and there might be better ways to practice. It was very sudden and took me by surprise. I realized I would have to give it serious consideration and couldn't just come to a quick decision. I didn't want to discuss it with anyone, partly because it felt like a forbidden subject to talk about, partly because I knew what people would say and that only I could decide this. I decided I should go ahead with my plan to travel around Thailand, though my enthusiasm was not great, especially since it was hot season by now. First, I took a train to Prajuapkirikan province and stayed at a small wat that a monk at Wat Pah had told me about. I'll skip the details and just mention a few salient points at this stage in the story. Ajahn Chah was quite famous by this time, 1977. People came all over Thailand to Wat Pah, and his name was known everywhere. As a disciple of his, I was well received in the places I traveled to, and when I saw other Wat Pah monks, such as at Wat Suan Mok, I felt that their appearance and conduct were pleasing and worthy of respect, much more so than the general run-of-the-mill monks, which isn't saying much, of course, and usually more than meditation monks from other places, though perhaps I was biased or conditioned to expect certain outward signs. Also, there was an especially great difference between the lay people in the Northeast and those anywhere else I went, and this, I think, is obvious to anyone who travels around Thailand. The Northeast is poor and can't compare with other areas as far as material offerings go, but lay people there are much more interested in actual practice, probably just because the plague of modernization, technology, material progress, etc., has not yet eaten too far into the substance of life there. At any rate, I began to feel much fondness for the miserable old Isan while I was in the south. As for walking Tudong, I set out from Prajuap to Suan Mok. I left in the late afternoon and kind of liked the walking, but the next day I started earlier. After walking for 10 minutes, my robes were soaked with sweat, and all I could think was, anybody who does something like this must be crazy. I was very happy when people offered to put me on buses or trains after that. After 3 months of stewing in my juice, the decision to disrobe finally appeared of its own. It clearly seemed the right thing for me to do. Luang Por was in England with Ajahn Sumedho at the time. Of course, I would have to wait for him to return. Contemplating the showdown, the moment when I would go to see him in Bangkok and, with Ajahn Sumedho sitting there, tell him that I was going to disrobe, I died 1,000 deaths. However, when I was in Chiang Mai, passing the remaining time until Luang Por's return and leaving open the possibility of a last-moment change of heart, I heard the news that Luang Por had decided to leave Ajahn Sumedho and the others in England. I'm ashamed to say it was a relief to know that I wouldn't have to face Ajahn Sumedho as well as Luang Por, though in the end it turned out more difficult to deal with Luang Por's subtle tactics than if it had just been the matter of brute force that I had expected. But back to the south for a moment. One of the great subjects of debate in those days was a young monk, formerly a Wat Pah Pong, who is believed by some to have become an arhat. I was discussing it with the abbot of the monastery in Prachuap, and he just said, "Arhants are really different from ordinary people, but it's very hard to know who's an arhat. You could be living with one and not know it." He repeated, "You could be living with one and not know it." And afterwards I wondered if he was hinting at something. He was an extremely even-tempered man, and I'd never seen him lose his cool. Who knows? I was never so intrigued by the question of what someone else might have attained, but it's nice to know that hidden away in various little corners throughout Thailand, there are practitioners who just do their thing and seem to benefit from it. Luang Por returned just before the beginning of Vasa. He was staying at Ma Bao's. With much trepidation, I went out there one night, planning to inform him of my decision, then go to Ubon with him to take leave of the Sangha. I wanted to disrobe at Wat Buwan. Doing it in Ubon would have been too heavy. I had already spoken to the abbot, who had ordained me as a novice, and had also ordered my pants. I'll leave it there. Few minutes for some questions or comments. He had also ordered his pants. I can't remember how it went with Luang Por Chah. I can't wait for the reading tomorrow. Find out how it goes for Apanyo.
Yeah, he tried several times.
Oh, okay.
I was spending the pansa at Wat Pah Pong, and he was at Wat Nana Chan.
Oh.
And after one of their sessions, he came out, where he was again going to take leave, and he saw me, and it was just, "I need a lawyer."
Wasn't it Ajahn Tun who also tried to disrobe several times? Never
Yes,
succeeded?
Ajahn Tun, the first few years of his monastic life, yeah, he was, because he was from quite a well-off family, and he hadn't really planned on, staying, and then, but yeah, when he would show up with his tray of take leave and his little bag of his pants and whatnot, then Luang Por would convince him to stay, or sometimes he'd just see him coming and he'd just get up and walk away. And then, after the first few years of doing, every year after the pansa, that would be a sort of a well-worn ceremony. and then of course, Luang Por Tun is turned into one of the kind of real solid Wat Pah Pong teachers and practitioners. Very, very noble.
Yeah, so if Varapanyo would have stayed ordained, he would have been one of the most senior monks in our community.
Yeah, he's two pansas senior to me.
Yeah, wow. Okay, we'll take a break. Puja at 7.